In the Vietnam War, beyond the machines of steel and fire that could crush any life in their path, there was another kind of machine. One that shredded morality, stripped away humanity, and left scars that no bomb or bullet could rival. We called it the rape machine. That was the name we gave to the South Korean troops. They were mercenaries in every sense of the word, disciplined, well-trained, relentless in battle. But beneath the uniform they were predators, beasts hiding inside the skin of men. They killed without reason, they aimed their rifles at civilians, and worst of all, they carried with them a habit so vile, so unforgivable. It was rape. I was a young American soldier in 1968 when I first encountered them. I had come to Vietnam believing the stories told back home, that we were there to fight communism, to defend freedom, to stand by our allies. But what I saw on the ground was something no training, no speech, no patriotic song had ever prepared me for. The enemy in the jungle was not the only danger. Sometimes the enemy stood right beside us, wearing the same uniform of an allied force. The South Koreans fought like demons, and in combat they were feared by the Viet Cong. But away from the battlefield, in the quiet villages scattered across the rice paddies, their true nature revealed itself. They did not need a reason. A young woman walking back from the well. A mother tending her child. A girl who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the Koreans it was enough. They would drag her away, laughing, their rifles slung casually as if this act was no different from lighting a cigarette. We Americans watched with a sickness in our stomachs. Some of my men turned their eyes away. Some clenched their fists. A few cursed under their breath. And I, like many others, felt a rage I could not describe. But rage alone does not stop a pack of wolves. Command never punished them, never questioned their actions. As long as the reports showed body counts and secured villages, the brass was satisfied. The truth, the shame, was buried beneath those numbers. It wasn't just once or twice. It was a pattern. A dark rhythm that followed their presence. Wherever they went, women disappeared, their cries smothered by gunfire or drowned in silence. And as much as I hated the Viet Cong, as much as I feared their ambushes and booby traps, it was not their bullets that haunted me at night. It was the sound of women crying, begging for mercy, begging for a shred of humanity from men who had none left to give. And so I stand here, decades later, still carrying that memory like shrapnel lodged in my soul. People ask me what was the hardest part of that war. Was it the firefights? The jungle diseases? The sleepless nights listening for the click of a tripwire? I shake my head. No. The hardest part was watching so-called allies, the men we fought alongside, commit crimes so foul they made me question who the real enemy was. The truth is simple. What broke me was not the Viet Cong's bullets. It was the cries of Vietnamese women being torn apart by men who wore the badge of our allies. That sound has never left me. It never will. And it was that sound, that memory that drove us, my squad, to make a choice no soldier should ever have to make. A choice that still burns inside me after all these years. When we first heard that South Korean soldiers would be fighting alongside us, most of us thought it was good news. Our officers praised them constantly, disciplined, ruthless in combat, men who had already proven themselves in Korea. If the Koreans are on your flank, the Viet Cong won't dare to push, one lieutenant told me. And at first I believed that. We were young, and the idea of having such fierce allies gave us a kind of reassurance. But out in the villages, beyond the patrol routes and the official reports, I began to see another side of them. It wasn't the disciplined professionalism that command bragged about. It was something darker, more primal. These men treated Vietnam not as an allies' country, but as conquered land. And whenever they saw women, their discipline melted away and revealed their true faces. I remember one late afternoon, the sun already sliding down the horizon, painting the paddies in red and gold. We approached a small hamlet where villagers were going about their routines, women drawing water from the well, old men resting by the trees, children chasing each other barefoot. The moment they saw soldiers, everything stopped. The children froze, the women pulled back, The elders lowered their eyes as if trying to shrink into the earth itself. And then the Koreans spotted the women. Two of them moved without hesitation, gripping a girl's arms so tightly she cried out. Another raised his rifle at the villagers, not to protect anyone, but to make sure no one dared interfere. They didn't speak Vietnamese, but they didn't need to. Their intent was written on their faces, in the smirks, in the crude gestures. The girl was dragged behind a hut while the rest of us stood rooted in place. We shouted, "Hey! Knock it off!" But they just laughed, barking words in their own tongue. Their rifles stayed pointed, their boots pressed forward, and the village fell into a silence that was worse than screaming. Because it was the silence of people who had seen this before. They knew resistance meant death. That was not an isolated moment. It became a rhythm that followed them, as predictable as the monsoon rain. In every settlement there were women taken. Married, unmarried, mothers with children, it didn't matter. To the Koreans none of that mattered. In their eyes, a Vietnamese woman was not a civilian, not a human being with dignity or family. She was simply an object, a thing to be broken and discarded once their hunger was spent. What unsettled me most was how normal it seemed to them. They didn't sneak around. They didn't hide behind the cover of night. They took women in daylight in front of villagers, even with Americans nearby. It wasn't a crime to them, it was routine. I saw it enough times to know. This was not the action of a few bad men, it was a culture within their ranks. And the villagers knew it too. You could see it in the way the women avoided eye contact whenever Korean boots approached, in the way mothers pushed daughters behind them, trembling but powerless. The fear in those villages was not of Viet Cong ambushes, it was of the men who were supposed to be their protectors. Every time it happened, my stomach twisted with sickness. My hands shook with rage I could not release. One of my buddies muttered through clenched teeth, "I'd rather take a bullet than watch this again." Another just stared at the ground, whispering prayers he knew would go unanswered. We were soldiers, trained to kill, but none of us had been trained to watch allies turn into monsters. The Viet Cong frightened me in the jungle, they laid traps, they fought with cunning and ferocity. But at least when they struck, it was war. With the Koreans it was not war. It was desecration. It was cruelty for its own sake. And each time I saw it, I wondered more and more, who was the real enemy in this land? The longer I stayed in Vietnam, the clearer it became that this wasn't just the behavior of a few rogue soldiers. It was a pattern, almost like policy. Wherever Korean units were stationed, the same whispers spread among the villagers. Women hid when they heard boots. Men lowered their eyes, not out of respect, but out of helplessness. The Koreans didn't need orders to commit these acts. They carried the habit with them like part of their uniform. I remember another day far out in the countryside. Our unit had been told to sweep through a cluster of villages. No firefights that day, no ambushes, no mines, just another operation that looked good on paper. But as we moved in, the Koreans began separating the villagers. Men on one side, women on the other. At first, I thought it was for questioning, maybe to check for Viet Cong. But the way they looked at those women made my stomach turn before anything even happened. One woman clutched her baby so tight the child screamed. A Korean soldier ripped the baby from her arms and shoved it into the hands of an old man. Then he dragged her away while the rest of his squad jeered. Another soldier, grinning, pushed a teenage girl to the ground. The villagers froze. They didn't run, they didn't fight. They had seen this too many times. Resistance was suicide and survival meant silence. We Americans shouted, tried to intervene, but the Koreans brushed us off like flies. One of my buddies raised his rifle in anger, but our sergeant grabbed his arm. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "This isn't our fight. Not our fight." That phrase burned into me. If protecting civilians wasn't our fight, then what the hell were we doing in Vietnam? Afterward, when the women stumbled back to the village, torn clothes hanging from their bodies, faces pale with shame, I couldn't even meet their eyes. The men of the village glared at us with hatred, and I understood why. To them we weren't protectors. We were accomplices. We stood by while wolves devoured their daughters and wives. The cruelty didn't stop there. Sometimes the Koreans killed the men afterward, just to make sure there would be no witnesses, no revenge. They called it security. I called it slaughter. In those moments, I began to wonder if they enjoyed the killing just as much as the violation. For them, the war was not about ideology or freedom. It was about domination. It was about proving power by destroying lives. Each time I watched it happen, I felt myself breaking a little more inside. You tell yourself as a soldier that there are rules. Even in war, there are lines you don't cross. But the Koreans crossed them every single day and nobody stopped them. Not our officers, not their commanders. The higher-ups only cared about body counts, not how those bodies came to be. What stayed with me most wasn't just the violence. It was the way the Koreans looked while they did it. Cold, casual, sometimes even smiling. Like it was just another part of the mission. And in that look, I realized something that has haunted me ever since. To them, Vietnamese women were never civilians. They were never mothers, sisters, or daughters. To the Koreans, they were nothing but things to be broken, trophies to be defiled. And that belief made them more dangerous than any Viet Cong unit I ever faced. We told ourselves we were fighting for freedom, for democracy. But standing there watching those women cry, I knew freedom had nothing to do with it. What good was democracy when your allies treated human beings like animals? What kind of justice could ever justify this? Some nights, I still hear the sound of those villages, the silence before the storm, the muffled cries behind closed doors, the bitter hatred in the eyes of the men who had lost everything but couldn't raise a hand. I carried a rifle in those days, but in moments like that, it felt useless. A weapon in my hands, and yet I couldn't stop what I knew was wrong. That helplessness turned into something else over time. Rage. Hatred. Not just toward the Koreans, but toward myself, toward my squad, toward the whole damn war. Because once you realize your allies are monsters, you start to wonder what you've become by standing beside them. And that question, what we were turning into, would soon push us to make a choice. A choice that could never be taken back. It happened on a day that, at first, seemed ordinary. Another sweep, another village tucked between the paddies and the tree line. We had been on the move since dawn, and by midday the heat was choking. The air felt heavy, pressing down on us like a weight. Sweat ran into my eyes, and every breath tasted of dust and gun oil. But I'd take that 100 times over what we were about to witness. We approached the village cautiously, scanning for signs of Viet Cong. But there were none. No ambush, no traps, no resistance. Just villagers going about their fragile routines. Women crouched over cooking fires, old men repairing baskets, children chasing each other barefoot across the dirt paths. For a moment it almost looked peaceful, almost normal. Then the Koreans moved in. Their boots hit the ground hard, their voices sharp and commanding, sending the villagers scattering like frightened birds. I watched them with that familiar unease twisting in my gut. I knew the pattern by now. And when I saw their eyes fix on two women, young, one barely more than a girl, the other perhaps in her 20s, I felt the blood drain from my face. They didn't hesitate. Two soldiers grabbed the older woman, dragging her by the arms as she kicked and screamed. Another shoved the younger one to the ground, pinning her with a knee. The village erupted in panic. Men shouting, women crying, children frozen in terror. A few villagers tried to rush forward, but the Koreans raised their rifles, barking threats, their fingers tight on the triggers. That stopped everyone cold. We, the Americans, stood just yards away. I remember shouting, "Stop. God damn it, stop." My voice cracked with fury, but they ignored me. My sergeant muttered, "Stand down." The words hit me like a slap. How could I stand down? How could any of us? But his eyes told me everything. If we interfered, it wouldn't be the Koreans who'd answer for it. It would be us. The older woman struggled, her cries piercing through the humid air. One soldier ripped at her clothes while the others held her down. She screamed for mercy, her voice raw with terror, but mercy wasn't in their language. The younger girl clawed at the dirt, trying to crawl away, only to be yanked back by her hair. Her sobs turned into choked screams as another soldier forced himself onto her. I felt my whole body trembling, not from fear of the Viet Cong, not from the war outside the wire, but from the sheer helpless rage boiling inside me. My fists clenched around my rifle until my knuckles burned white. Every instinct screamed at me to pull the trigger, to cut those bastards down where they stood. But I froze. We all froze. We were soldiers sworn to orders, chained by command, and in that chain lay the weight of our own cowardice. I can still see their faces. The girl's wide, terrified eyes staring right at me as if begging me to save her. The older woman's mouth open in a scream that never seemed to end. Around them, the villagers sobbed quietly, too afraid to move. The Koreans laughed, a laughter that cut through me worse than any bullet. And I realized then that war wasn't only about killing. War was about power, about domination, about stripping away every shred of humanity until nothing was left. The Koreans weren't fighting the Viet Cong in that moment. They were fighting decency itself, and decency was losing. That scene would never leave me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The cries, the begging, the laughter. Those cries haunt me to this day. No bomb, no bullet, no explosion could ever be as devastating as the sight of those women being torn apart before my eyes. What made that day worse wasn't only the act itself, but the way time seemed to stretch and slow down. Every second felt like an eternity, every sound carved itself into my memory. The slap of boots against dirt as they pinned the women down. The metallic clatter of rifles as villagers were shoved back at gunpoint. The sharp crack of fabric tearing. And above all, the screams. I'd been in firefights before, with bullets snapping past my head and explosions shaking the ground under my boots. Those moments were terrifying, but they ended quickly. You fought, you fired back, and when it was over, you either lived or you didn't. But this was different. There was no fighting back, no end in sight, only a kind of drawn-out horror that left you powerless. The older woman screamed until her voice broke, her cries turning into hoarse gasps. The girl's sobs were muffled by the hand clamped over her mouth. And in that suffocating silence of the villagers, I realized something that would haunt me forever. Those cries would never leave me. Even now, decades later, when I close my eyes, I still hear them echoing in the back of my skull. And the truth is, no bomb I ever heard, no bullet that ever whizzed past me, was as devastating as the sight of those women being torn apart in front of me. One of my buddies whispered through clenched teeth, "We can't just stand here." His face was red, his body shaking like a taut wire about to snap. Another muttered, "Orders, orders, God damn it." The words felt like a curse. Orders, always orders, tying our hands while women screamed for help not 10 feet away. I wanted to raise my rifle, to put a bullet through every one of those bastards. But the weight of command pressed down on me like chains, and I hated myself for letting it hold me still. The Koreans, meanwhile, carried on with a cold efficiency that sickened me. They didn't act like men losing control, they acted like men carrying out a routine. One would hold the arms, another the legs, and a third would take what he wanted. When he was done, he'd step aside and the next would take his turn. There was no rush, no shame, no hesitation. Just a brutal rotation as methodical as reloading a weapon. The villagers stood frozen. I caught the eye of an old man, his hands trembling as he clutched a child to his chest. His gaze wasn't just fear, it was fury, pure and silent. A hatred that burned so deep I could feel it searing into me. And I knew in that moment that he didn't distinguish between Koreans and Americans. To him we were all the same. We were all guilty. Because in his eyes, standing by and doing nothing was just as monstrous as committing the act itself. And he wasn't wrong. I lowered my head, ashamed, unable to watch but unable to look away either. I kept telling myself that if I stepped in, we'd all be dead men. That was the excuse. That was the lie. The truth was simpler, we were cowards that day. We failed. When it was over, the women lay broken in the dirt, their clothes shredded, their faces pale and hollow. The Koreans pulled up their trousers, laughing as if they had just finished a game. They lit cigarettes, spat on the ground, and swaggered away without a glance back. To them it was nothing. To us it was everything. And to the women, it was the end of their world. When the Koreans finally walked away, the silence that settled over the village was suffocating. No one moved at first. The villagers stood frozen, their faces carved with shock and grief. The two women lay crumpled in the dirt, their breathing shallow, their eyes staring at nothing. The older woman's body trembled as she tried to pull the remains of her clothing around her. The younger girl curled into herself, clutching her torn dress as if it could shield her from what had already been done. I wanted to go to them, to kneel down and help them up, to say something, anything, that might ease their pain. But my boots felt nailed to the ground. I was afraid not of the Koreans but of the truth. Nothing I could say would matter. Nothing I could do would undo what had just happened. One of the villagers finally stepped forward. A young man, maybe in his 20s, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles shone white. For a moment I thought he would attack the Koreans despite the rifles still slung at their sides. But then he stopped, trembling, tears streaking down his face. He dropped to his knees beside the girl, whispering words I couldn't understand. His voice cracked, and though I didn't know the language, I knew the meaning. He was begging for forgiveness, though for what I couldn't tell. For his helplessness? For being alive while she suffered? That sight cut deeper than anything. The women weren't just broken, the whole village was broken with them. Shame rippled outward like a wound, infecting everyone. Men lowered their eyes, mothers clutched their children tighter, elders stared into the distance with hollow gazes. The Koreans hadn't just violated two women, they had violated the entire community. We regrouped later, sitting in the dark with only the glow of cigarettes to light our faces. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, one of my buddies whispered, "I can't take this anymore." His voice was hoarse, like sand scraping against stone. Another nodded, eyes blazing in the dim light. "If they do this again, we end it. I don't give a damn what command says." I stayed silent, but inside I knew I agreed. Something had changed in us that day. Watching those women destroyed, hearing their screams, feeling the villagers' hatred, we couldn't go back to pretending this was just another war, that we were just following orders. The war had shifted. The enemy wasn't just Viet Cong in the jungle. It was the monster standing beside us, wearing the same uniform of an ally. That night I lay awake, staring at the canvas roof of my tent. The cries replayed in my head over and over like a broken record. I'd been through firefights, ambushes, mortar barrages, but none of it stayed with me like this. This wasn't just violence. It was evil, pure and naked. And I knew deep down that it would never leave me. We thought the worst thing in Vietnam was dying. But that day taught me something different. Death is quick. It's brutal, but it's over in a flash. What those women went through, that was worse. That was a death you carried while still breathing. And it was a burden they would bear forever. And so would we. The argument began almost the moment we sat down. Nobody needed to break the silence gently. It was shattered by anger before the circle was even complete. "We can't let this happen again," one of the guys snapped, his voice trembling with fury. "Next time we stop them. I don't care what it takes." Another soldier fired back instantly. "Stop them? Oh, you planning on walking into their tent and shooting them? You'll end up with a court-martial before the week's out. Better that than standing by while they destroy women in front of us." The first man growled, fists balled tight against his knees. The air thickened with their words. We were used to arguments in the field, about rations, about orders, about who was pulling their weight, but this was different. This wasn't about survival or soldiering. This was about who we were as men. One of the older guys, a quiet fellow who usually stayed out of trouble, finally spoke. "We could report it." He didn't sound convinced even as the words left his mouth. "There's a chain of command for a reason." The reaction was immediate. Another soldier barked a laugh, bitter and sharp. Report it? Are you out of your damn mind? Command doesn't want to hear it. They've known all along. You think they're blind? They'll bury it, and they'll bury us right along with it. The circle erupted, men talking over each other, voices low but heated. Some argued that it wasn't our place, that we weren't here to police the Koreans. Others said the opposite, that if we did nothing then we weren't men at all. You call yourself a soldier, one man snarled, but what kind of soldier lets allies rape women and does nothing? And what kind of soldier, another snapped back, throws away his own life on a suicide mission because of something he can't control? Their words crashed like waves against each other. I sat there listening, my heart hammering in my chest, feeling the pull of both sides. The truth was there was no safe choice. Every path led into darkness. Finally, the sergeant, who had been silent all this time, raised his head. His voice cut through the noise, calm but heavy. Enough. The argument stopped cold. We all turned toward him. There are only 3 options, he said evenly. 1, we let it go. We say nothing. We live with it. His eyes swept over us, hard as steel. 2, we report it. You all know what happens then. Nothing. He paused, letting the silence weigh down. 3, we handle it ourselves. The words sank in like stones dropped into deep water. No one rushed to respond. We just sat there, staring at the dirt, each of us feeling the weight of what he had laid out. One man whispered, "If we handle it ourselves, we're crossing a line we can't come back from." The sergeant nodded slowly. That's true. But ask yourself this, what does it mean if we stay silent? You think silence makes us innocent? No. Silence makes us guilty. Every bit as guilty as the ones laughing while those women screamed. I felt the truth of it drive into me like a blade. It wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about survival of the soul. If we stayed silent, we'd rot from the inside out. One by one, heads began to nod. The anger didn't vanish, but it hardened into resolve. No shouting now, no desperate words. Just quiet agreement, like men making peace with something inevitable. I looked around the circle, seeing the same thought etched on every face. We weren't boys anymore. We weren't even just soldiers. We were men staring at a choice that would define us forever. And in that moment we chose. We didn't call it vengeance. We didn't call it justice. We just called it what it was, action. We knew we were about to cross a line, but we also knew that silence itself was a crime, that keeping quiet would make us no better than the ones we despised. The decision had been made, but carrying it out was another matter. For the rest of the night, none of us slept. We lay awake in our bunks, the sound of insects buzzing outside, the memory of screams still clawing through our skulls. By dawn, our faces were pale, drawn tight by sleeplessness and the weight of what we were about to do. We didn't speak of it openly, not in words, but every glance between us carried the same message. Tonight. It would be tonight. The Koreans strutted about camp as if nothing had happened. They joked, smoked, slapped each other on the back. To them, the women they had broken were already forgotten. That was what sickened me most. For them, it hadn't even been an event. Just another night. Another routine. I remember staring at them across the clearing, my fists clenched in my pockets. I had killed men before, Viet Cong fighters in the heat of combat, but this felt different. This wasn't a firefight. This was a reckoning. When the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the ground, we began to prepare. We didn't sit around a table drawing up plans. It was simpler than that. We loaded our rifles, checked our magazines, and made sure our safeties clicked off smooth. The silence between us was thick, broken only by the metallic sounds of bolts sliding, rounds chambering. One of the younger guys whispered, "God forgive us." Another answered, his voice flat as stone, "God's not here. We are." That line hit me hard. We weren't acting as soldiers under command anymore. We weren't following orders or carrying out strategy. We were stepping into the role of judge, jury, and executioner. And the truth was, it terrified me. My hands trembled even as I tightened them around the rifle. But beneath the fear there was rage, and that rage burned hotter than the tremor of doubt. We waited until the Koreans drifted away from camp, 6 of them moving together down the dirt track that led toward the edge of the jungle. Maybe they were heading for another sweep. Maybe they were looking for another village. Whatever their destination, they weren't coming back. Our sergeant raised his hand, signaling for silence. We moved like shadows, slipping through the trees, flanking them on either side. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heartbeat pounding so loud I feared they might hear it. The Koreans laughed among themselves, completely unaware. One pulled out a cigarette, another adjusted the strap of his pack. They walked like men who feared nothing. That arrogance sealed their fate. When we reached the spot, a narrow clearing where the path split and visibility was clear, the sergeant stopped. He looked back at us, eyes hard, expression unreadable. No words were needed. We all knew what came next. I gripped my rifle tight, the stock slick with sweat. For a split second, doubt surged again. Was this right? Was this justice or just another crime? My stomach twisted, my throat dry. But then I remembered the women in the dirt, their broken cries, the laughter of these same men echoing in the night. The rage came back and I felt my fingers settle against the trigger. The sergeant gave a single nod. That was the moment we crossed the line. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. The Koreans walked on, unaware, their boots crunching softly on the dirt path. We crouched in the shadows, rifles leveled, fingers resting on cold steel. The sergeant's hand stayed raised for a heartbeat longer, then dropped. The world exploded. Gunfire cracked like thunder, deafening in the narrow clearing. Muzzle flashes lit the trees in strobe bursts. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, the barrel spitting fire. The Koreans staggered, spun, collapsed under the hail of bullets. One tried to shout, but the sound was swallowed in the storm of rounds. There was no return fire. They hadn't even raised their rifles. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The first seconds blurred, my mind a haze of smoke, noise and adrenaline. I remember the way one man's body jerked as my rounds tore through him. I remember the sight of another falling face first into the dirt, his cigarette still burning between his fingers. My stomach lurched even as my hands kept firing, as though my body and soul were split apart, one consumed by rage, the other recoiling in horror. Then silence. The sudden absence of sound was more jarring than the gunfire itself. The Koreans lay sprawled in the dirt, 6 dark shapes against the pale earth. Smoke drifted from our barrels, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the sweet stench of blood. I lowered my rifle slowly, my hands trembling. My ears rang, my chest heaved. Around me the others stared at what we had done, their eyes wide, faces pale in the fading light. Nobody spoke. The sergeant finally broke the silence. Check them. We moved forward hesitantly. One of the Koreans still twitched, a faint gurgle rising in his throat. Without a word, one of our men stepped up and put a single round into his chest. The sound was sharp, final. I looked down at the bodies. They weren't faceless enemies in the jungle anymore. They were men who had laughed while women screamed. Men who had strutted through villages like predators. Now they were lifeless, sprawled in the dirt like broken dolls. And yet I felt no triumph. No victory. Only a hollow ache in my chest, a trembling in my hands that wouldn't stop. This wasn't war. This wasn't combat. This was something darker. As I stood there, staring at the blood soaking into the earth, a thought cut through me like ice. For the first time in this war, I had killed not because of orders, not because of strategy, but because of conscience. The weight of that truth pressed down on me, heavier than the rifle in my hands. We stood over the bodies for what felt like an eternity, the jungle pressing in around us, the air thick with smoke and blood. None of us moved. None of us spoke. The weight of what we had done sat heavy on our shoulders, thicker than the humid night air. Finally, the sergeant said quietly, "We need to go." The words snapped us back into motion. We dragged the bodies into the brush, covering them with branches and leaves. It wasn't much of a burial, just enough to buy us time. My hands shook as I pulled at the branches, the sticky warmth of blood on my skin. Every snap of a twig seemed deafening, like the jungle itself was watching, judging. When the last body was hidden, we stepped back, staring at the rough mounds of leaves. 6 men. 6 soldiers. Allies once. Now corpses, their lives ended not by the Viet Cong, not by the war, but by us. Fear crept in next, sharp and cold. If anyone found out, we were finished. Court-martial, prison, maybe worse. The army would never admit why we had done it. They would strip us down to criminals, nothing more. That thought gnawed at me even as I tried to push it away. But beneath the fear there was another truth, something I couldn't deny. A grim sense of justice, raw and bitter. For the first time since I set foot in this country, I felt that what I had done mattered. Not for strategy, not for territory, not for some general's map. But because those women's screams had demanded it. Still, the satisfaction was fleeting. By the time we made it back to camp, the hollowness had already set in. My rifle felt heavier than ever. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I sat in the dark, staring at them, remembering how easily they had squeezed the trigger. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, frozen in shock, twisted in pain. And yet, layered over those faces were the women, broken and crying in the dirt. The images fused together until I couldn't tell one from the other. I realized then that we hadn't just killed 6 men. We had killed a part of ourselves. The war had already taken so much: friends, innocence, peace of mind. But that night it took something deeper. It blurred the line between justice and vengeance, between soldier and murderer. And though none of us said it out loud, we all felt it. We had crossed over and there was no way back. Back at camp, the weight of what we had done hung over us like a storm cloud. No one spoke of it directly. We didn't have to. The silence between us was thick, heavier than words. We knew what came next. We had crossed the line in the jungle, but now we needed to erase the tracks. The sergeant gathered us quietly. His face was drawn, eyes hard. "We need a report," he said. "And it has to be airtight." We sat around a dim lantern, the glow casting long shadows across our faces. Ideas came slowly, haltingly at first, until the shape of the story began to form. Viet Cong ambush. 6 Koreans dead in the firefight. We had been pinned down, too far to assist, forced to watch the massacre unfold. By the time we got there, it was already over. Each detail was carefully crafted, each phrase sharpened like a blade. The lies flowed smoother than I had expected. Maybe that was the most frightening part. How easily a man can weave fiction when the truth is unbearable. When the report was finished, the sergeant read it aloud. His voice was steady, professional, the tone of a man used to reciting facts. But the words weren't facts. They were dirt thrown over 6 shallow graves. We all signed our names at the bottom. My hand shook as I pressed the pen to paper, but I signed anyway. With that signature, I felt as though I had buried the truth beneath my own skin. Afterward, we looked at each other, eyes hollow, faces pale. No one dared speak the real story. No one dared breathe it aloud. We had made a pact in silence, stronger than any oath. The truth would stay buried with us. Yet even as I lay back on my bunk that night, staring at the canvas ceiling, I felt no release. Killing those men hadn't lifted the weight, it had only changed its shape. Justice hadn't freed me. It had shackled me in another way. The faces of the Koreans still haunted me, tangled with the faces of the women, all of them trapped in my mind like ghosts that wouldn't rest. And then, as if mocking our torment, the morning came, and the war rolled on as though nothing had happened. Orders, patrols, maps spread across tables. Business as usual. 6 Koreans were gone and the world didn't even blink. It was then I understood a truth far darker than the killing itself. In war, truth often dies before men do. The report went up the chain the next morning. We handed it in without ceremony, Just another piece of paper among hundreds that passed through command every day. My stomach knotted as I watched the officer skim the lines. I half expected questions, suspicion, maybe even an interrogation. But none came. The officer barely raised an eyebrow. 6 Koreans down VC ambush, he muttered. Unfortunate, but these things happen. He initialed the page, tossed it onto a stack of reports, and reached for his coffee. That was it. We filed out of the tent in silence, each of us stunned in our own way. Weeks of rage, a night of blood, hours of careful lying, and it all disappeared into a pile of paperwork, forgotten before the ink had dried. At first I felt insulted. Didn't they care? Didn't they wonder why 6 trained men had fallen without so much as a radio call? Didn't they think it strange that we, stationed so close, had survived unscathed? But then the anger gave way to realization. This was war. Men died every day, often without explanation. Command didn't want truth, they wanted neat reports that kept the gears turning. To them, 6 bodies were just numbers on a page. And in a twisted way, that cold indifference mirrored the Koreans themselves. The way they had tossed aside those women like trash was no different from how the army now tossed aside its own dead. The cycle of cruelty and forgetting spun on, swallowing everything in its path. For us, though, that indifference was a kind of shield. If command didn't care, then our secret was safe. No questions meant no danger. The truth we had buried in the jungle would stay buried. That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. The knot in my gut loosened, my hands finally still. Around the fire, I saw it in the others too. The way shoulders relaxed, the way conversation stumbled back into ordinary rhythms. We didn't speak of the Koreans, not directly. But in the unspoken language between us, the message was clear. Justice had been done. They had laughed while women screamed, and now the earth held them silent. I won't lie and say I slept peacefully that night. The faces still came, hovering in the darkness behind my eyelids. But alongside them came another thought, quieter, steady. They deserved it. And for the first time I believed it. The days after blurred into the endless rhythm of war. Villages burned, others fell silent under smoke. Friends vanished in a heartbeat, their young faces erased by a single blast. And then, somehow, 1968 passed and I survived to return home. But not everything came back with me. I still remember the faces of the women, still hear their raw cries echoing through the night. I remember the Koreans too, collapsing under our fire, not as faceless enemies, but as a mirror reflecting what men can become when cruelty takes over. Monsters. There are nights I still wonder, did we do the right thing? Was that justice or only vengeance dressed in another uniform? I don't know the answer. What I do know is this: in war, truth often dies before men do. And that is why this story must be told, so it doesn't rot away in silence like those forgotten reports. If you believe these memories matter, share them. Let the next generation understand that war is not only steel and fire, but the darkness inside the human heart. Leave a comment below. Tell me, if you had been in our place back then, what would you have done? And if you want to hear more memories, more untold stories from the Vietnam War, hit like and subscribe to this channel. Every share, every word you write in the comments helps keep these stories alive, helps keep the truth from being buried again. War already took too much. But as long as we remember, the truth still has a chance to survive.